I have recommended to customers before for certain projects, especially large-scale tabletops like this, to use veneer, but there seems to be a stigma with veneer. People assume it's cheaper than solid hardwood, and not only is that not necessarily the case as far as structure goes, but it's also not necessarily the case as far as the cost of the project goes. But needless to say, I bit the bullet for this one because of, as you'll see later in the piece, there was really no way to do this without making it out of veneer, which is what I told the customer. And I made bought a rather powerful vacuum press and made myself a rather large, I think this is 12 by 52 inch vacuum bag in order to press this. I've used it twice already. It works great. Once I've gotten a little more pressing under my belt, I'll make a very in-depth video of all of my sources and how I made this and all that sort of stuff. But for this project, I'm going to go through it fairly quickly. I've also pressed the torsion box. So inside the torsion box, it's not a stereotypical box. It's got this impregnated honeycomb impregnated resin, and that is super solid, much faster and more lightweight to make than the sort of lap joint structures you'll usually see. The concept I got for that came from this book. I use a lot of book-based resources for woodworking. I find them to be the best ones. Taunton Press is usually affiliated with Fine Woodworking, and I find them to be a great source. It's a source I don't have to fact check. I know if I'm getting information from there, it's accurate and up to date. And then same thing, I got a veneering book, same publisher associated with Fine Woodworking in order to do this project. So I'll try and remember to put all my sources and materials in the description. So I'm starting back at the base, and like I said, the original somewhat square glue-ups of the bulk of the pedestal was about 8 inches. I didn't have enough material to make the bottom part of the base 8 inches, so I knew I was going to have to trim some down. That trimming ended up being only about an 1/8 inch material. That's what I'm doing here. I just put a stopped cut at the top of that where the break in the curve is, and then I could go through and slice the material and clean it up with a belt sander. Like I said, these pedestals are going to have a final sanding, which I'm probably not going to film, and that's where I'll really clean up all of these pieces. For the bottom stretcher, like I showed in the last video, I glued up this oak. This is about 1.5 inches tall by a little over 4 inches wide. I'm going to scrape off the bulk of the glue, and then I'll send this through the planer and flatten the whole thing out. To form the lap joints for the top where I'm going to put the stretchers on, I'm using a concept quite similar to how I make breadboard ends. It's basically a cradle with 2 perfectly flat edges on either side on the same plane. It could slide over the top of the pedestals, and I can route perfectly straight lines. You could see that those 2 pieces of plywood are on the same plane, so I could route one side, flip it over and route the other, and then I'll have perfect laps. So there's the mark from where I'm routing. I have this set offset for the base of the router, and I could just go through and do that. Now I believe my pieces were a little over 1.5 inches thick, so that's how far I'm going to go down. I have a really heavy duty 2-inch straight cutting bit in the router. It's the same one I used to cut the holes in the pedestal, and I'll just go through and cut these. Now you'll see a little bit later in the front I also route a little bit, because these have to be pretty close to perfect for that joint to work, and I don't want to just chisel into the front and get a not flat line in the front. So here's showing how I'm just going to take a little bit of material off the front so I have a flat reference point for removing the rest of this with a chisel. You could remove the whole thing with the router. It's just going to be a lot slower of a process. You'll see how fast chiseling this stuff off goes, because you're going with the grain, so this stuff will just flake right off pretty easily, especially where the glue joint is. And then I could just go down to the bottom. You could see how I could use my chisel as a reference off that flat edge I made with the router, and then just clean up in the middle. And that's what I'm left with. here's my pieces and how they're going to fit in there, and that I just like to do it this way. They won't ever be able to bow or sag because they're sitting on top of this gigantic bulky pedestal. So because of the shape of these, it was a little hard to do the top, but you can see all I did was flip it over. I didn't move that jig that's a cradle, and then I could just route the top. Once I had this propped up a little bit, it was a little bit easier. Could go through and route the top. After I did the first one, I decided to route the back and the front at the same time, just to save a little bit of time. But it's essentially the same process for this top side as well as for the other pedestal. It's a quick, easy jig that I could just disassemble once I was done with it. You can see it just slides on just like this. I have a reference mark, and I put the router on there and get the whole thing flat. So for these, I'm not doing much to them. I'm just going to cut 45s off the ends to give them a little bit of decorative detail. I came down an inch and then used my square to mark a 45. Stuff like this that's under a table I don't get crazy with, because unless you actually bend down and look under the table, you won't really be able to see them anyway. But I do like to finish them off slightly. And I'm just going to use a hand saw, circular saw, in order to cut those 45s off. Now I'm not permanently attaching these yet. I'll switch out these screws with dowels, but I just put everything on there. I put a clamp on there so that they wouldn't pull apart, and then put 2.5 inch screws on either side. That will hold it steady until I'm ready to permanently attach those two arms. So then back to the bottom stretcher, here's where I'm planing this down. This glued up really nicely. I think I took about 1/8 of an inch off of each side, and then that was just about done. So this is just showing the stretcher. I have these about 7 feet apart, so that will give me a 16-inch overhang on either side, which is a good amount of distance if you want to put a chair at the end of the table. So with that, I can measure the inside. So that was showing you a measured center, and then I measured out from center to both of my ends, so I have it perfect there. And I'm going to be putting a slight tenon on the end as well as a lap joint. I don't want to remove a ton of material out of this pedestal base. So I'm just putting, cutting off the shoulders like on the radial arm saw. When my shop's really full, I utilize a lot of tools I might not necessarily use, even though I do use the radial arm saw for tenoning a lot, just because the table saw's usually got something on top of it. But the radial arm saw, I could set it up with a stop and raise that blade fairly high on that saw and get nice cuts on either end. I'm also going to be cutting this into a slight lap because I don't want to remove a ton of material off of the pedestal as well, because this is going to sink into the pedestal a little bit. Joints are very important, but if you remove too much material, which is a common mistake I see in furniture, then the wood's rendered very weak and the joint will break. I fix a lot of furniture where people craftsmen even put really nice joints, mortise and tenon joints, but the mortise doesn't leave enough material, or the tenon takes way too much material, and over time those joints will break. I actually just fixed a couple clawfoot Victorian chairs that had that problem. So then all I did was lay this on top of the base. I can mark where I'm going to cut out those pieces, and because I have such a big hole in here now, I could also take this to the radial arm saw and just cut a bunch of curves to remove this material. Whenever I do this, I always mention this seems tedious. It really isn't. It takes 2 seconds to set this saw up, a couple curves, and I can clean it up really quickly. Just gives nice, consistent results. I'm not a fan of spending hours upon hours setting up jigs. I like that I could put a stop on there, raise the blade, and then make a bunch of consistent cuts, even if it is slightly tedious making all those curves. And then I could just clean that up, and you can see this is a little proud still. I can adjust that later. I'd rather have it proud than the cut being too deep. So you can see about 3/4 of an inch is going to go into the pedestal, and that will lock this whole thing in place. So I just put the pedestal in place. I made a pencil mark, and I could take that out and then put a 3/4 inch mortise in this piece. So the easiest way to do this now is I just have a spade bit, and I could drill a couple of holes. I have a piece of tape on there as a depth gauge, and I could go down. I actually think this ended up being about an inch. Could go down about an inch and then square up the whole thing with the chisel. Just put some shins under there so this doesn't rock back and forth, because the shape of this looks great on the table, but it's such a pain when we're working with something that has some sort of bulbous face or bulbous surface, because it just wants to move around on you so much. But like I said, I could go through and square that up with a chisel. I did this identically on both of these, and then I could add that stretcher into those grooves. Now this whole piece has been like this for a week, because after this I switched gears and started doing the top, and none of this has glue or screws except for the screws on those top side stretchers in it yet, and the whole thing's still held in place, and it's actually holding some stuff now, so I'm really happy with how sturdy the base is. Obviously, maneuvering these pieces in my uneven workshop is always the funnest part of any project, but you could see how nice that looks once it's in place. And I have all my inside marks and my numbers on there, so when I take these things apart, it's easy to put it back together. So the veneer I got from a company called Certainly Wood. I got 16th inch veneer because it's going on a tabletop. I want a little extra material in case I have to sand it, or even if the customer decides to refinish it down the line. If you use really thin veneer, you easily go through the veneer. I really like this company for multiple reasons. I got them off of a couple the source to go to them offline, and one of the reasons I like them is because I was going back and forth with one of their salesmen, and I was looking for 16th inch veneer, and I accidentally picked out, I think, a 32nd inch, which would have been a huge pain if I accidentally ordered it. But we had been working together, and he pointed out the fact that it wasn't the right thickness, which is just above and beyond in my book, and saved me so much time and cursing by him correcting it before I placed the order. So huge shout out to them. This is not a sponsored post or anything. I just like to point out really good companies. The vacuum pressing stuff I got was from Joe Woodworker. He's another source I've heard about in multiple other people's YouTube videos. He sells just about everything. I like him because he is also a wealth of free information, which is what I try to do with my YouTube channel. So there was places where you could buy some of this stuff a little cheaper, but I do like to support people that are spending their time giving out free information and testing materials. Like I said, once I've finished this project and got a couple pressings down, I am going to make an in-depth video of all these materials, how to make the vacuum press. I'll show that as well as a couple other things. That's just too long for this video, but you could see it comes in pieces. I decided to do a vacuum press instead of the one that utilizes your air compressor, even though they're a little bit cheaper, just because my air compressor was on the brink of being able to pull vacuum out of the size bag I needed, and instead of stressing about it the whole project and hoping that it would be able to pull it, I just decided to bite the bullet and buy a vacuum press that could. It was probably about $100 more expensive, but if it didn't work with my air compressor, it would have been more than $100 to fix that mistake. So for the vinyl bag, he has instructions on his website on how to make the vinyl bag. I got the vinyl from Joann's because it's a little bit cheaper. I was not happy with the fact that I bought 8 yards and it came in 2 separate sections, so I have to have a seam on it. It ended up working out. I'm not really faulting Joann's. It's probably because the bolt of vinyl isn't as long as I needed, so it had to have a seam. But I got it from Joann because if you don't shop at Joann's, they have amazing coupons. And all this vinyl, I don't even think it was $100, and it would have been almost twice as much at almost any other source. So I'm just going around the outside and cleaning up the seam where I'm going to glue this together with acetone. It etches the surface. And then I just have some vinyl cement, just going through and lifting up the piece, adding some of that cement. Now, in the instructions, I might have glazed over it because I was doing a lot of building this week and reading instructions. On the can, it says to let it sit up for 2 to 3 minutes. I didn't do that, but I do end up clamping the piece, which is, I think, what gave me a nice sturdy joint and seam on those sides. I'm using this roller to kind of press it down, but then you could see before I left for the night, I put some clamps on all of those seams I freshly glued in order to get a nice seam in the morning. Let this stuff really set up under pressure. Now you could use the other material for bags is polyurethane, I believe, or polyethylene. I can't quite remember. It's a little more expensive. It's supposed to last longer. All these materials was already expensive. The vinyl was really cheap from Joann, so that's what I went with. And then I bought the connection spout also from Joe Woodworker. Same process. You just cut a little 3/8 inch hole, attach this, and then with the kit he gave you the spouted barb, and then I could just attach the hose, and that was pretty much it. So the first thing I'm doing is making the solid edges. This is 3/4 inch MDF. I made the mistake, I haven't done this in years, of messing up the nominal thickness as well as actual thickness. So I drove to a Home Depot that was about 45 minutes away expecting to get inch MDF, and they ended up having 3/4. So I bought 1/4 inch birch veneer ply, and I'm just going to make little sandwiches. And I'm going to try out the vacuum press, which ended up working out nicely because I could try it out on something that wasn't extremely valuable or time consuming to make. You can see I'm just gluing this together. I usually don't use a paint roller for this, but the thing with vacuum pressing is you have to move fairly quickly. I'm not a fan of single-use disposables in any aspect of my life, but I will say if you're going to get into vacuum pressing large pieces, I definitely would recommend getting some paint rollers to get the glue on there super fast. I put some brads in here to hold everything in place as I put it into the machine. I'm going to show you the platen and everything I made and more stuff in the other video. I just wanted to end this with showing how the press works. And then it just pulls vacuum. So this is actually a 240 volt pump, so it goes right into my table saw outlet. And this is sped up a little bit, but it pulls vacuum very quickly, kind of flatten everything out. And I'm really happy with something that I could build quite quickly. I think it took about a half an hour to put this together. It's right where it's supposed to be, and the bag worked really well. I was pleasantly surprised. He actually recommends going through and adding some more sealant the next morning, but I didn't need to do that. You could see the seam in the bag held as well. I was really happy so far with how this is working. Now the two edge pieces the next morning, they did move a little bit even with the brads. It's not a big deal for what I'm building, but it is something to consider in the future. The ones in the center didn't move at all. You could see they're pretty flat. And then that's about it for this video. In the next video I'm going to start showing you how I make the torsion box. I can just trim off those uneven parts, as well as putting the veneer on that torsion box. So there'll probably be at least 2 to 3 more videos pulling this whole thing together with finishing as well.